Hey, I'm Greg. Welcome to the Hubris News Report.
I'm Lucas.
Today's topic, we'll be discussing the Siege of Paris, which took place from 885 to 886 AD. An extremely short siege, but it is still very important to the history of France and the downfall of the Vikings.
At the time of the Siege of France was a part of the Western Frankish Kingdom. The Frankish Kingdom was more or less the western section of the Carolingian Empire in the early Middle Ages. The biggest threat affecting European rulers at this time were the Vikings, mainly the Danes and the Norsemen. Throughout England, they had forced their laws and rules on the people who and where. Some religions, while their reach stretched as far as the Mediterranean. The Vikings had traveled through many river systems in Europe, stirring up trouble. All these reasons for these were the hatred of the Carolingian Empire.
The Vikings had attacked Paris before, numerous times, and each time they left only after they got whatever their demands were, either a lot of treasures or bribes from other higher powers. The Vikings basically had almost full control of Paris. In 864 AD, the bridges were constructed on the Seine, two at either end of Paris. This river now runs right through Paris, but at the time, Paris was on an island, the Seine flowed right around it.
The Danes' leader, Siegfried, demanded a bribe from Charles, who was the French leader at the time. Charles refused to submit to him, and obviously the Vikings began their march on Paris. Sigurd took 700 boats with 30,000 Vikings, a ridiculous number for such a small city such as Paris. The Vikings traveled to France by boat up the Seine River. This is where the bridges come into play that had been built previously. Towers had also been built along both sides of the river to help fend off attackers. The Vikings arrived on November 25th, 1885, and began by asking for tribute. This denied, they settled for a siege.
Quite. On the 6th of November in 885 AD, the Vikings attacked the northeast tower with ballista, catapults, and other sorts of siege vehicles, constantly covering the towers with arrows and stones. They were repulsed by a mixture of hot wax and pitch. However, that day, all Viking attacks were repulsed, and during the night, the Persians constructed another level onto the tower for even more fortifications. On the 27th of November, the Vikings' attack included mining, rams, and fire this time, but to no avail. The tower would not fall to the Vikings, even though they were greatly outnumbered.
For months, the Vikings made the countryside of Paris their new home, making trenches and supplies for themselves off the land. For months, the Vikings made the countryside of Paris their new home, making trenches and supplies for themselves off the land. In January of 886, they tried to fill the river shallows with debris, plant matter, dead animal, and human bodies so as to get around the tower with their infantry, but they failed yet again. They continued for the next 2 days, but on the third day they set 3 ships alight and sent them towards the wooden bridge. The burning ships sank before they could set the bridge on fire again, but the wooden bridges were greatly weakened regardless.
On the 6th of February, rains caused the river filled with debris from the Vikings' attempts at weeks earlier. On the 6th of February, rains caused the river, filled with debris from the Vikings' attempts of weeks earlier, to overflow, and the bridge gave way to the massive flood. With the bridge gone, the northeast tower was now isolated, with only 12 defenders left inside of it. With no defense from the Vikings anymore, they marched forward and began to attack the heart of Paris, full of rage and anger from being stopped at the bottleneck for so long.
The Vikings left a force behind, but mostly went ahead beyond Paris to pillage and loot the surrounding countryside. At this time, their chief successfully slipped some men through the Norse lines to go to Italy to plead with Charles to come to their aid. Henry, Count of Saxony, Charles' chief man in Germany, marched to Paris. The morale of the Vikings was low as they saw many reinforcements from Italy march into Paris as a defense.
In the summer, the Vikings made a final attempt to take the city, but were denied entry one last time. A huge imperial army arrived in October and scattered the Vikings. Charles sent the defenders down the river to ravage Burgundy, which was in revolt. When the Vikings withdrew from France next spring, he gave them 700 pounds of silver as promised.
In the end of all things, the Siege of Paris was a liberating event for the people of France because they finally defeated their enemies, the Vikings, and put down a big threat. It showed the Vikings that they did have someone who would actually rise against them.
Well, that's it for this week's report. Tune in next time for another exciting, totally awesome news report on something really old.